Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and used book collector, and today we're talking about The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by the infamous H.P Lovecraft. So this is going to be mostly a spoiler-free review. I will talk some spoilers towards the end of the video, but I'll put a tag up so you can skip that if you haven't read the story or if you don't care. But today I'm just going to talk about my general thoughts in what I liked about this story, what I didn't like, and maybe a bit about my background with reading Lovecraft, and maybe even talk about the movie adaptation. So let's get into it. So The Case of Charles Dexter Ward is a novel by H.P Lovecraft. It's the only one in the collection I have that's considered a novel. The rest are considered novellas or short stories. I'm not sure if it's the only one that's actually classified like that, but that's the case in the version I have. And the story follows a young man from Providence in the 1920s named Charles Dexter Ward, who starts doing research about an ancestor he discovers that was seemingly erased from history. And in doing this research, he goes down a dark hole of madness and learning some dark secrets about his family and the mysterious figure in his family's past named Joseph Curwen. So this story kind of follows a very typical Lovecraftian structure where it starts at the end and there's a lot of questions raised, and the story is told in a series of flashback structures. There's actually a couple layers of flashbacks within this story, which is nothing new to Lovecraft. This isn't really a structure of storytelling that I particularly love, especially in movies. I really don't like when they start with a flash forward towards the end. But since I'm so used to reading Lovecraft, I'll give it a pass for now. I'm just used to this when it comes to him, so it's not too bad. I was a latecomer to the horror genre growing up, and even up until my early 20s, I really didn't want to have anything to do with horror. I was scared of anything having to do with horror. But around the time I was in university, I decided, okay, I think it's time I get into this genre that everyone seems to be obsessed about, and I've been a horror fan ever since. And in getting into horror literature, I knew that I needed to read some of the staples of the genre and started with Stephen King, but I also realized I should read people like H.P. Lovecraft as well because he's considered a titan of horror. So I picked up this copy of the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, and that was, I think, in 2018, and since then I've read almost all of his stories, and as of completing The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, I only have The Shadow Out of Time and Haunter of the Dark, which is his last story, remaining. And it's been an interesting ride. You know, Lovecraft is a super controversial figure, and it was interesting to get into what his kind of storytelling method was, why is he so popular, and also discovering why he's so controversial. But now let's get into the actual review of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and this part will be spoiler free. So this one was a good story. I enjoyed it quite a bit. It wasn't my favorite of the Lovecraft stories I've read. It was definitely the longest. It was fun, classic Lovecraft, and you kind of get what you're expecting. It has so many of his tropes and the staples of what he writes. It's got the flashback structure, the indescribable horrors, the protagonist hell-bent on discovering some arcane knowledge, and some not-so-casual racism. To give him credit though, in this one he actually did describe most of the horrors, I believe. He didn't use the usual cop-out of saying there's this grand, cosmic, absolutely terrifying idea or entity and then just saying it was indescribable and leaving it at that. He actually did a good job in this one of explaining the horrors to you, not necessarily exactly what they were, but in a way that made you feel scared in the moment and to kind of feel that creeping tension and understanding of what's about to happen. And in saying that this is his longest work, I think that maybe one of the drawbacks of this is that his style to me has worked better in shorter works. His style of writing is sometimes kind of challenging to read, not necessarily from his method of storytelling, but from the way he uses language. H.P. Lovecraft intentionally used very archaic language. He was very inspired by Edgar Allan Poe and used a lot of that flowery, overly descriptive wording to get his story across, but hasn't bothered me too much in the past with reading his works, the shorter ones especially, but in reading something that was 100+ pages of this long, overly descriptive, intentionally archaic style of writing, got a bit slow at times, but that doesn't mean that the actual pacing of the story was slow. I thought that the pacing was actually really well done. I wasn't bored in reading this story at all. Sometimes Lovecraft can dip into tangents of descriptions or lists especially, and there was only a couple points I think in this one where I was sort of starting to tune out, and that was when he would write letters that the characters were reading, and in a couple of these instances the letters were written in very, very old 17th century archaic text. But overall I thought the pacing was well done. This story also had some pretty creepy sections. Lovecraft has kind of been hit or miss a bit for me when it comes to the actual scares or the creepy or tense part, but I thought that this book he did pretty well with it. There's one sequence in particular I'm talking about where a character goes underground, and that whole section there was my favorite part of the story and was definitely creepy. So good job, HP. One of the things that was a drawback to the story for me actually, and this isn't new to this story, this is something that has come up in a lot of his tales, is that the twist or the reveal or the conceit of the whole thing has been very obvious from very early on in the story. And in this case, the mystery or the reveal or whatever you want to call it was painfully obvious from much earlier on in the story, where there's, you know, you're at a certain point, you have 70 pages left and you know exactly what's going to happen at the end. So for me, it kind of sucked a bit of the air out of the tension in discovering what was going to happen later on in the story. But overall, I still enjoyed it, and that didn't draw back too much for me, as it was a fun ride from start to finish. I think he does this intentionally to a degree to try to layer the tension, but I find that he kind of struggles to find the balance between, you know, giving you an understanding of what's going to happen to up the stakes and the tension versus taking the air out of the tension altogether. Something I also liked in this story as well is the villain. I'm not going to say who the villain is, what their motives are, anything like that until the spoiler section, but I can just say that Lovecraft is famous for his villains, Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, characters like that, but in this case there was a very grounded, personal villain that I think was really interesting and a bit different from what he's written before, and I enjoyed to see how that character played out in the story and what his role in the protagonist's world meant to the story at large. And sometimes villains in H.P. Lovecraft stories can be very abstract or not really affect the plot at all, and I thought it was kind of refreshing to have someone so directly affecting the plot. Alright, I'm gonna jump into a bit of spoiler talk, so if you haven't read the story or just don't care, skip to the time I put up on screen because I'm gonna reveal everything about the story. So the part I want to elaborate on regarding, you know, the tension being totally drawn out of the story and knowing the twist or the conceit was that Curwen's return and his, you know, kind of replacing of Charles Dexter Ward was so obvious from very early on that the whole time I was kind of just waiting to get there to the point where the main character, Dr. Willett, or I guess maybe not the main character, but definitely the protagonist by the end, realizes what's going on. Lovecraft does this all the time in his stories where it's very obvious what's going to happen. At least in this case, you know, there wasn't that last line italicized reveal like he does in a lot of his earlier short stories. There was a proper reveal in the last scene, and the way the last scene actually played out with Dr. Willett and Curwen was fun and a little tense too. You don't see a lot of, you know, tense dialogue scenes between two characters in Lovecraft stories. Stephen King, I think, said in a talk that Lovecraft was really bad at writing scenes. He kind of just wrote stories that kind of are lists or a sequence of events happening, but he wasn't good at writing actual individual scenes. And I thought in this case it was very refreshing to see a tense scene between two characters who knew exactly what the stakes were and what the other person was trying to do, and that was really fun and a good way to end the story. And before it became obvious that Curwen had replaced Charles, I thought the story might go the way Thing on the Doorstep went, and spoilers for The Thing on the Doorstep if you haven't read that one, where a character, or an ancestor specifically, was gonna sort of inhabit the body or replace the character. So for a second there I thought, oh, it's gonna go that way where Curwen's sorcery, somehow he's gonna get into Charles's body, and I thought when they explained it in the beginning that his body was beginning to change, but I thought that Charles's body was sort of morphing into Curwen as he was inhabiting or possessing the younger man's body, but that was quickly dispelled, and I just realized that Curwen had killed Charles and just replaced him because they look identical. In the past, Lovecraft has recycled a lot of his ideas. He's done this in short stories where he had something that he was thinking about or an idea that wasn't fully fleshed out, and then in a later story he would kind of do a second draft of that. So I thought that might be the case here. I'm not sure which story came first, if Thing on the Doorstep or this one did, but I knew he had recycled story threads before or ideas, so I wouldn't have been surprised if he had done that idea in both stories, but that didn't turn out to be the case. And like I said in the spoiler-free section, I thought that Curwen was a pretty successful villain. He was very present in the story, he had a tangible presence that affected Charles and the scope of how the entire story played out, and I thought that was very refreshing. And I thought it was hilarious that the first way that characters started catching on to Curwen having replaced Charles was that his banking was all messed up, his signatures were all wrong, and the checks weren't coming in or something like that, and people were like, oh, what's going on? We should inspect this. This is weird. Charles isn't acting like himself, which is certainly like an Al Capone moment where they couldn't get him for anything but tax evasion. And to have a sorcerer, this cosmically terrifying mystical villain like Kerwin just being got for money stuff was pretty funny. Alright, so that's it for the spoiler section, and the last thing I wanted to talk about before I wrap up is the movie adaptation. So The Case of Charles Dexter Ward was adapted into the movie The Resurrected, directed by Dan O'Bannon and starring Chris Sarandon as Charles Dexter Ward. If you don't know who Dan O'Bannon is, he's the guy who wrote Alien, and he directed The Return of the Living Dead, which is one of my favorite zombie movies, and is also a very fun movie, much like this one, The Resurrected. This movie was just, you know, a good time from start to finish. It was a little silly, but it knew it was silly, and it was just having fun with the source material and wasn't trying to be too dark with it, although there were some pretty dark parts. It was very fun, and the hour and 40, I think, runtime of it flew by. This one borrows heavily from the story. There's not much that's too different, save for one important thing. It takes sort of a film noir approach to the story, which is something that you know that I like. Where the main character, who's kind of an outsider to what's happening with Charles Dexter Ward, instead of being a doctor, is a private detective. And the story uses the flashback structure as well, but a little differently. It shuffles things around in the story so that they unfold in more of a way that lends itself to a mystery plot, and I felt it was more organic than the way maybe things were structured in the book. And there were some really fun gore effects as well. I think I should have assumed this was going to be the case coming from Return of the Living Dead, but I was actually surprised to see that the gore effects were really well done, really fun, and pretty gross at times. So if you're into that sort of thing, you like horror movies, you like special effects, gore, and all that stuff, this is one that you definitely have to watch. And if you're a fan of the book and you haven't watched this, I would highly recommend it too. It is loyal to the story enough to a point where, you know, there's respect for the story, and the things that they do that are different, I think make sense. Alright, so that's it. That's my review of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward by H.P Lovecraft. So at this point, like I said earlier, I only have 2 stories left in my entire collection of H.P Lovecraft and his collected works. I haven't read any of his letters or many of the collaborations he's done with other writers, but as for his solo works, I only got 2 left. And I don't know how I feel about that. Am I sad that this is kind of ending? I'm gonna have no new Lovecraft stories, and of course there's gonna be none more written in the future. Or am I gonna be happy to kind of say, okay, that's done, time to, you know, I read that staple of the genre, time to move on to different things. So let me know in the comments if you've read The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Did you like this story, or did you have more of a mixed or negative reaction to it? Also, let me know what your favorite Lovecraft story is. I think mine is a tie between 3, being The Color Out of Space, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and At the Mountains of Madness. Remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. Thanks for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.